The rain drummed against the chapel windows like impatient fingers, each drop racing the others down the glass in silent competition. Marcus Chen adjusted his black tie for the third time, watching his 8-year-old daughter Emma fidget with the program in her small hands. They were strangers here, among faces he'd never seen before, attending the funeral of a woman who had changed their lives without them even knowing her name until 3 days ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As the service began, Marcus noticed something that made his heart skip. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting completely alone in the front row. No hand to hold, no shoulder to lean against, just empty space stretching on either side. Of her like an ocean of loneliness. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. Marcus was rushing around their small apartment, trying to get Emma ready for school, while simultaneously packing lunches and searching for his car keys. Single parenthood was a juggling act he'd been perfecting for 3 years now, ever since. His wife Sarah died in that car accident that still haunted his dreams. "Dad, my backpack's stuck!" Emma called from the hallway closet. Marcus hurried over, gently untangling the strap from where it had caught on a coat hanger. As he pulled it free, something else came tumbling down, a small wooden box he'd never seen before, landing with a soft thud on the hardwood floor. "What's that?" Emma asked, crouching down to examine it. The box was simple but elegant, made of dark cherry wood with tiny brass hinges. There was no lock, just a small clasp that opened with the gentlest pressure. Inside, nestled in faded purple velvet, were 3 items that would change everything: a silver locket, a yellowed envelope addressed to Sarah Chen, and a photograph of a woman Marcus had never seen before, holding a baby. Emma picked up the photograph with the careful reverence children reserve for things that seem important to adults. "Dad, who is this lady? And why does she have the same last name as us on this envelope?" Marcus took the envelope with trembling fingers. The return address was local, just 15 minutes away, but the postmark was from 18 years ago. Inside was a letter written in elegant cursive, the ink faded but still legible. "My dearest Sarah, I know you're angry with me, and you have every right to be. I made choices that hurt you, that drove you away from our family. But I need you. To know that not a day goes by that I don't regret the words I said, the bridges I burned. You are my sister, my only family, and I love you more than my pride. I'm sick, Sarah, very sick. The doctors say I don't have much time. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you might find it in your heart to let my daughter know she has an aunt who loved her from afar. Her name is Isabella, and she's going to need someone when I'm gone. I've enclosed a locket. It was our mother's. Please, if you can find it in your heart, wear it so she'll know your family. All my love, Margaret Chen." Marcus sank onto the couch, the letter falling from his suddenly numb fingers. Sarah had never mentioned having a sister. In all their years together, through all their conversations about family and childhood, she had never once spoken of a Margaret Chen. Yet here was proof, written in someone's dying words, that his wife had a family he'd never known about. "Dad, you look funny," Emma said, climbing onto the couch beside him. "Are you okay?" He wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. How could Sarah have kept such a massive secret? How could she have had a sister, a sick sister with a daughter, and never mentioned it? The questions swirled in his mind like a storm. But underneath them all was a more pressing concern. If Margaret Chen had written this letter 18 years ago, and if she had been sick then, what had happened to her daughter Isabella? That evening, after Emma had gone to bed with promises that they'd figure out the mystery together, Marcus sat at his laptop and began searching. Margaret Chen, the address from the letter, anything he could find. What he discovered made his stomach drop. Margaret Chen died 3 days ago. The obituary was brief, mentioning only that she was survived by her daughter Isabella, age 6, and that services would be held at Riverside Chapel on Tuesday morning. There was no mention of another family, no indication that anyone else would be there for this little girl who had just lost her mother. But what struck Marcus most was the timing. Margaret had written that letter 18 years ago, when Isabella would have been born. She'd been sick then, but somehow she'd lived another 18 years, long enough to raise her daughter, long enough to hope that someday her sister Sarah might forgive her and be there for Isabella, except Sarah was gone too. The only family Isabella had left was people she'd never met, people who didn't even know she existed until 3 days after her mother's funeral was announced. Marcus couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about that little girl, Isabella, who was probably lying awake in some foster home or with temporary guardians, wondering why no one from her family had come to say goodbye to her mother. He thought about Sarah, about the secret she'd carried, and why she'd felt she couldn't share it. Most of all, he thought about the locket, still sitting in its velvet nest, waiting for someone to claim it. By morning, his decision was made. He called in sick to work, arranged for Emma to stay with their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, and drove to Riverside Chapel with the wooden box on the passenger seat beside him. The chapel was smaller than he'd expected, with maybe 30 or 40 people scattered among the pews. Most of them looked elderly, probably neighbors or friends of Margaret's, but in the front row, exactly where he'd somehow known she would be, sat a little girl with dark hair and a black dress that looked too big for her tiny frame. Isabella, she, was so still it was almost unnatural for a child her age. Her hands were folded in her lap, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the closed casket at the front of the chapel. She looked like she was trying very hard to be brave, to be good, to not cause any trouble for the adults who had more important things to worry about. Marcus slipped into a pew near the back, not wanting to intrude, but unable to leave. The service was simple and dignified. The pastor spoke about Margaret's kindness, her dedication to her daughter, her quiet strength in facing years of illness with grace. A few people shared memories. A neighbor who remembered Margaret always having fresh cookies for the children on her street. A co-worker who talked about her infectious laugh despite her struggles. But no one mentioned family. No one spoke of sisters or aunts, or the connections that bind people together across years and misunderstandings. It was as if Margaret Chen had existed in a bubble, loved by many, but truly known by few. When the service ended, people began filing out slowly, stopping to offer condolences to the funeral director or to sign the guest book. Marcus watched as they passed by Isabella, some pausing to pat her shoulder or whisper a few words, but most simply walking past with sympathetic glances. The little girl remained seated, her small figure dwarfed by the empty pew. It was clear she was waiting for something or someone, but the chapel was emptying and no one was coming to collect her. Finally, a woman in a grey suit, probably a social worker, approached and began speaking to her in low, gentle tones. That's when Marcus knew he couldn't just walk away. Whatever had happened between Sarah and Margaret, whatever secrets his wife had felt she needed to keep, this little girl was family. She was Emma's cousin, Sarah's niece, and she was alone in the world, except for people who were paid to care about her. He stood up and walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the now quiet chapel. The social worker looked up as he approached, her expression professional but wary. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly. "Are you Isabella?" The little girl looked up at him with eyes that were startlingly familiar. The same deep brown as Sarah's. The same serious expression Emma got when she was thinking hard about something important. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus knelt down so he was at her eye level, pulling the wooden box from his jacket pocket. Isabella, my name is Marcus Chen. I think your mother and my wife were sisters. The social worker immediately stepped forward, her protective instincts kicking in. Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and... But Isabella wasn't paying attention to the adult conversation. Her eyes were fixed on the box in Marcus's hands, recognition flickering across her small face. That's Mama's box, she said, reaching out tentatively. She always kept it on her dresser, but she wouldn't let me look inside. She said it was for someone special. Marcus opened it carefully, revealing the locket, the letter, and the photograph. Isabella's breath caught when she saw the picture of her mother holding a baby. That's me, she whispered, touching the photograph with one tiny finger. Mama used to tell me stories about that day when I was born. She said it was the happiest day of her life, but also the saddest, because the person she most wanted to share it with wasn't there. The social worker was looking between Marcus and Isabella with growing confusion, but Marcus only had eyes for the little girl who was examining the locket with wonder. This was supposed to be for Aunt Sarah, Isabella continued, her voice getting stronger as she spoke. Mama told me I had an aunt, but she lived far away and they had a fight a long time ago. She said maybe someday Aunt Sarah would come back and we could be a real family. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Isabella, I have to tell you something sad. Aunt Sarah, she died a few years ago, but she was my wife, and we have a daughter named Emma. She's your cousin. Isabella looked up at him then, really looked at him, as if she was trying to decide whether this stranger could be trusted with the enormous weight of her grief and hope. You came, she said finally, and her voice held a wonder that broke his heart. Mama always said family finds a way to each other, even when everything seems impossible. You're the only one who came. The social worker was asking questions, talking about procedures and verification and home studies, but Marcus barely heard her. All he could see was this little girl who had been sitting alone at her mother's funeral, waiting for a family that didn't know she existed, and the way her face had lit up when she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He thought about Emma back at home, probably helping Mrs. Rodriguez make lunch and wondering about the mystery they'd discovered in the closet. He thought about Sarah and the sister she'd lost touch with, the regrets she must have carried. He thought about Margaret, raising her daughter alone, while hoping that someday the bridges she'd burned might be rebuilt. But mostly, he thought about Isabella and the way she'd whispered, "You came," like it was the most miraculous thing in the world. Because sometimes family really does find a way. The ride back to Marcus's apartment was filled with an unusual quiet. Isabella sat in the back seat next to Emma, clutching the wooden box against her chest, like a lifeline. The two girls had taken to each other immediately, Emma with her natural enthusiasm for new friends, and Isabella with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been alone for too long. "Can I see the locket again?" Emma asked softly, understanding instinctively that this wasn't a time for her usual boundless energy. Isabella opened the box carefully, lifting out the silver chain. The locket was heart-shaped and delicate, with tiny engravings of flowers around the edges. When she pressed the small clasp, it opened to reveal two miniature photographs. One of a young woman who looked remarkably like both girls, and another of two little girls standing by a lake, their arms around each other's shoulders. "That's Grandma Helen," Isabella said, pointing to the first photograph. "And those are Mama and Aunt Sarah when they were little, before the big fight." Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart clenching at how naturally Isabella had said, "Aunt Sarah." She spoke as if she'd known about their family connection. Her whole life, as if meeting them wasn't a miracle, but simply something that had been delayed. The social worker, Ms. Patricia Hendricks, had agreed to let Isabella come home with them temporarily while the paperwork was sorted out. It helped that Marcus had brought documentation proving his marriage to Sarah, and that Isabella had immediately recognized Sarah's name and seemed genuinely comfortable with him. Still, there would be interviews, background checks, and a mountain of legal procedures before anything became official. But for now, Isabella was safe, and she wasn't alone. Their apartment suddenly felt smaller with an extra person, but also warmer somehow. Marcus watched as Isabella examined everything with quiet curiosity. The photographs on the walls, the books scattered on the coffee table, the collection of Emma's artwork stuck to the refrigerator with colorful magnets. "This is where you live?" Isabella asked, not with judgment, but with genuine interest. "It's not very big," Emma said apologetically. "But Dad says home isn't about how much space you have, it's about who you share it with." Isabella nodded solemnly, as if this was a profound truth she was filing away for future reference. "Mama and I lived in a tiny apartment too. She said small spaces hold love better because it doesn't have anywhere to escape to." That evening, while the girls sat at the kitchen table working on a puzzle Emma had pulled from her room, Marcus made phone calls. First to his boss, explaining that he'd need some time off for a family emergency. Then to his lawyer, asking about guardianship procedures. Finally to his mother in Oregon, trying to explain how their family had suddenly grown by one. "You did what?" Dorothy Chen's voice crackled through the phone speaker. "Marcus, honey, I know you have a good heart, but you can't just bring home random children from funerals." "She's not random, Mom. She's Sarah's niece. She's Emma's cousin. She's family." "Family you didn't know existed until yesterday," his mother pointed out, with the practical wisdom that had guided him through his childhood. "What do you know about this girl's situation? What about her mother's medical history? What about Mom?" Marcus interrupted gently. "I know it sounds crazy. Trust me, if someone had told me a week ago that I'd be applying for emergency guardianship of a 6-year-old I'd never met, I would have thought they were insane. But you should see her. She looks exactly like Sarah did at that age. And she's been through so much, and she has no one else." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Dorothy sighed. "What does Emma think about all this?" Marcus looked over at the kitchen table, where Emma was patiently explaining to Isabella how corner pieces were different from edge pieces. Isabella was listening intently, occasionally asking questions that made Emma beam with the pride of being a helpful teacher. "Emma thinks we should build bunk beds in her room so Isabella can stay forever," Marcus said. Another pause. Then, "Well, I suppose I better start planning a trip to meet my new granddaughter." The word granddaughter hit Marcus unexpectedly hard. In just one day, Isabella had gone from being a stranger to being family in the minds of everyone who mattered. It should have felt rushed, overwhelming, too fast. Instead, it felt like something that was meant to happen, as if the universe had been waiting for the right moment to bring them all together. That night, after they'd improvised a bed for Isabella on the couch and she'd fallen asleep clutching a stuffed elephant Emma had donated, Marcus found himself going through Sarah's things for the first time since she'd died. He'd boxed up most of her belongings years ago, unable to bear looking at them but unwilling to let them go. Now he searched through photograph albums, letters and keepsakes, looking for any trace of the sister Sarah had never mentioned. What he found was more heartbreaking than he'd expected. Hidden in Sarah's jewelry box, underneath the earrings she never wore and the watch that had belonged to her father, was a small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The return address on all of them was the same as the one on Margaret's letter, but these were postmarked over many years, some from when Sarah was in college, others from after she and Marcus had gotten married. Margaret had never stopped trying to reach out, never stopped hoping that whatever had driven the sisters apart could be healed. The letters were full of updates about Isabella's milestones, her first steps, her first day of school, the way she loved books and drawing and asked endless questions about everything. Margaret had written about her own health struggles, her fears about what would happen to Isabella if she died, her desperate wish that Sarah would forgive her and be part of their lives. But the letters had never been opened. Sarah had kept them, which meant something, but she'd never read them. Whatever had happened between the sisters had cut so deep that Sarah couldn't bear to hear Margaret's voice, even in written form. The last letter was different from the others. It was thicker, and when Marcus opened it, he found not just pages of Margaret's careful handwriting, but also drawings, dozens of them in crayon and colored pencil, clearly done by a child's hand. "These are for Aunt Sarah," Margaret had written. "Isabella draws pictures for you all the time. She doesn't really understand why you're not here, but she knows you're important. She says maybe if she draws enough pictures you'll want to come visit us. I tell her you live far away, but the truth is I don't know how to explain that sometimes people we love hurt us so badly that we can't find our way back to each other. I'm running out of time, Sarah. The doctors say months, maybe weeks. I know. I don't deserve forgiveness, but Isabella deserves to know her family. Please, if you won't do it for me, do it for her." The drawings were typical of a young child's artwork: stick figure families with enormous smiles, houses with crooked chimneys and flowers that were bigger than the windows, animals that looked more like colorful blobs than any recognizable species. But they all had one thing in common. They all included an extra figure labeled Aunt Sarah in careful, uncertain letters. Isabella had been drawing pictures of an aunt she'd never met, including her in every family portrait she created. Somehow, this little girl had held space in her heart for a relative who was more like a fairy tale character than a real person. Marcus sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by letters and drawings, finally understanding the weight of secrets and regret that Sarah must have carried. Whatever had happened between the sisters, it had been serious enough to keep Sarah from opening letters about her niece's childhood. But it hadn't been serious enough to make her throw the letters away. She'd kept them all, every single one, which meant that somewhere in her heart she'd still loved her sister. She'd just been too proud, or too hurt, or too afraid to do anything about it. The next morning brought new challenges. Isabella woke up early, disoriented and frightened, until she remembered where she was. Marcus found her sitting on the couch, staring out the window with the kind of stillness that comes from too much loss. "Good morning," he said quietly, sitting down beside her. "How did you sleep?" "Okay," Isabella whispered, though the dark circles under her eyes suggested otherwise. "I kept forgetting Mama wasn't in the next room. I almost called for her when I woke up." Marcus's heart broke a little more. "That's normal, Isabella. When someone important to us dies, it takes time for our hearts to remember they're gone. Sometimes that forgetting is a gift. It means love is stronger than loss." Isabella considered this with the seriousness of someone much older than 6. "Mama used to say that people we love never really leave us. They just live in a different room in our hearts. Your mama sounds like she was very wise." She was. Isabella's voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. She knew a lot of things. She knew how to make pancakes shaped like animals, and she knew which stars were which. And she knew that sometimes being brave means asking for help. "Is that what you're doing now? Being brave by asking for help?" Isabella turned to look at him with those serious brown eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah. "I'm not asking. You already helped. But Mama always said that when good things happen, we should pay attention and be grateful, because good things are gifts we don't always deserve." Emma emerged from her bedroom then, her hair sticking up at odd angles and her pajamas twisted from sleep. She took one look at Isabella sitting so formally on the couch and immediately plopped down on the other side of her. "Do you want to help me make breakfast?" Emma asked. Dad taught me how to make French toast, and it's really good, except sometimes I use too much cinnamon and it makes you sneeze. Isabella's first real smile since Marcus had met her spread slowly across her face. I've never made French toast. Mama mostly made oatmeal because it was cheap and filling. French toast is way better than oatmeal, Emma declared with the authority of someone who had lived 8 whole years. Come on, I'll show you how to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. It's trickier than it looks. As the girls disappeared into the kitchen, Marcus heard Isabella's quiet laughter for the first time, a sound like silver bells that made him think of Sarah, who had laughed the same way when she was truly happy. Titi Day brought a parade of visitors and phone calls. Miss Hendricks returned with more paperwork and questions. Marcus's neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, came by with a casserole and offered to help with childcare. Even his boss called to check in and reassure him that his job would be waiting whenever he was ready to return. But the most important conversation happened that afternoon, when Isabella found the photo albums Marcus had been looking through. The night before. "That's Mama," she said softly, pointing to a picture of Margaret as a teenager. "She's so young there. And that's Aunt Sarah, isn't it?" The photograph showed 2 girls at what looked like a family barbecue, their arms linked, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's range. They couldn't have been more than 15 and 13, still young enough that whatever would eventually drive them apart hadn't happened yet. "They look happy," Isabella observed. "They did love each other," Marcus said carefully. "Sometimes people who love each other very much still have fights that are hard to fix." Isabella nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. "Mama told me that she and Aunt Sarah had a big fight, but she never told me what it was about. She said it was grown-up stuff that didn't matter anymore, except it did matter because it kept us apart." "Do you wish you could have known Aunt Sarah?" "Every day," Isabella said simply. "Mama used to tell me stories about when they were little, how Aunt Sarah would read to her when she had nightmares, and how they would build forts in their bedroom and pretend they were princesses in a castle. Mama said Aunt Sarah was the bravest person she knew, but also the most stubborn." Marcus laughed despite himself. "That sounds like the Sarah I knew." Isabella studied his face carefully. "You miss her too." "Every day," Marcus echoed her earlier words. "But now we have each other," Isabella said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that seemed to be her specialty. "And Emma. And maybe that's what Mama and Aunt Sarah would want, for us to be the family they couldn't figure out how to be." That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, Isabella in Emma's room this time, in a sleeping bag on the floor because she'd asked if she could be closer to her cousin, Marcus made one more phone call. He called Margaret's old number, not expecting anyone to answer, but hoping he might reach a landlord or neighbor who could tell him more about Isabella's situation. Instead, a familiar voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello? Isabella?" Marcus was surprised. "Sweetheart, what are you doing answering this phone?" "I asked Ms. Hendricks if I could keep Mama's phone for a little while." Isabella's voice was muffled, as if she was speaking quietly to avoid waking Emma. "Sometimes I call it just to hear her voicemail message. It makes me feel less lonely." Marcus's throat tightened. "Isabella, are you lonely now? Here with us?" "No," she said quickly. "Not lonely like before, but sometimes I miss her so much it feels like I can't breathe. And then I remembered that she wanted me to find you, and I feel better." "She wanted you to find us?" There was a long pause. Then Isabella said, "The day before she went to the hospital the last time, Mama gave me the wooden box. She said if anything happened to her, I should make sure the important people got it. She said family has a way of finding each other even when it seems impossible." Marcus closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the thought that Margaret had spent her final days making sure her daughter wouldn't be alone, that she'd trusted somehow, that the sister who had never answered her letters would still be there for Isabella when it mattered most. She was right, Marcus said softly. Family does find a way. I know, Isabella whispered. You came to the funeral. You're the only one who came. And in those simple words, Marcus heard not just gratitude, but the beginning of healing for all of them. Single dad found a girl alone at a funeral. Part 3-3. Weeks into their new life together, Isabella had her first nightmare. Marcus woke to the sound of muffled crying coming from Emma's room, followed by his daughter's concerned whispers. By the time he reached their doorway, Emma was sitting cross-legged on her bed, while Isabella curled up in the sleeping bag, tears streaming down her face. "She's scared the social worker lady is going to take her away," Emma explained, in the matter-of-fact tone she used when translating for adults who didn't understand kid logic. "I told her you won't let that happen, but she's still worried." Marcus knelt beside Isabella's makeshift bed, his heart aching at how small she looked in the oversized pajamas Emma had lent her. "Hey, sweetheart, can you tell me what's wrong?" Isabella sat up slowly, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "I dreamed that I woke up, and you decided you didn't want me anymore. That you remembered I wasn't really your daughter and sent me back to the place with all the other kids who don't have families. The foster care facility where Isabella had spent the week before Margaret's funeral had clearly left its mark. Marcus had visited it once during the legal proceedings, and the well-meaning but overwhelmed staff had done their best with too many children and not enough resources. Isabella had been just another temporary placement, another file in an endless stack of cases. "Isabella, look at me," Marcus said gently. "Do you know what adoption means?" She nodded hesitantly. "It's when people choose you to be their kid forever, even though you weren't born to them." "That's right. And do you know what I've been doing for the past 3 weeks? I've been filling out adoption papers, I've been talking to lawyers and social workers and judges, telling them all the same thing, that you belong here with us and we want to make it official." Isabella's eyes widened. "Really? You want to adopt me?" "We all do," Emma chimed in from her bed. "I asked Dad if I could sign the papers too, so it's extra official that you're my sister." "The process takes time," Marcus continued, "but Ms. Hendricks says everything looks good. Your mom left a letter with her lawyer saying that if anything happened to her, she wanted you to be with Sarah's family. Since I was married to Sarah, and Emma is Sarah's daughter, that means us." Isabella absorbed this information with her characteristic seriousness. "So I can stay, even when you get tired of having 2 kids instead of 1? Even when I do something wrong?" "Isabella," Marcus said, settling more comfortably on the floor beside her, "do you know how many times Emma has done something wrong since she was born?" Emma giggled from her bed. "Like 1,000,000 times. Remember when I tried to give the cat a bath and flooded the bathroom? Or when you decided to paint a mural on your bedroom wall," Marcus added, grinning at the memory, "with permanent markers." "That was artistic expression," Emma protested, but she was smiling. "The point is," Marcus said, turning back to Isabella, "families don't give up on each other because of mistakes. That's what makes them families. We love each other when we're good, when we're bad, when we're scared, when we're happy. Love doesn't have conditions." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Finally, she said, "Mama used to tell me that love is the only thing that gets bigger when you share it. She said most things get smaller when you divide them. But love multiplies." "Your mama was a smart woman," Marcus said softly. "Can I ask you something?" Isabella's voice was barely above a whisper. "Anything. Why didn't Aunt Sarah ever come to see us? If she would have wanted me to be with you, why didn't she visit when Mama was sick?" It was the question Marcus had been dreading, partly because he didn't have a good answer, and partly because he was still working through his own feelings about Sarah's choices. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that adults sometimes let pride and old hurts keep them from doing the right thing? I think, Marcus said carefully, that Aunt Sarah was carrying around some heavy feelings that made it hard for her to reach out. Sometimes when we're hurting, we build walls to protect ourselves, but those same walls can keep out the people we love. What kind of heavy feelings? Marcus glanced at Emma, who was listening intently. This conversation was as much for her as for Isabella. Emma deserved to understand why her mother had kept such a big secret from their family. I don't know the whole story, Marcus admitted, but from what I can piece together, your mama and Aunt Sarah had a fight when they were younger, a really big one, and instead of working it out, they both got stubborn and stopped talking to each other. But that's silly, Emma said. When I fight with my friends, Mom always said... She stopped, abruptly, her face falling as she remembered that her mom wasn't there to give advice anymore. What did she say? Isabella asked gently. Emma took a shaky breath. She said that being right isn't as important as being kind, and that when you love someone, you find a way to forgive them, even when they hurt your feelings. So why didn't she forgive Isabella's mama? Emma continued, her 8-year-old sense of justice clearly troubled by the contradiction. I think she wanted to, Marcus said honestly. I found all the letters your mama sent, Isabella. Aunt Sarah kept every single one, even though she never opened them. I think she was planning to reach out someday, but she ran out of time. Isabella considered this. So the fight was bigger than both of them? Sometimes that happens with grown-ups, Marcus said. We make problems more complicated than they need to be. Well, Isabella said with the decisive tone of someone who had made up her mind about something important, Emma and I aren't going to do that. If we have a fight, we're going to fix it right away, so we don't waste time being mad when we could be having fun instead. Emma nodded solemnly. We pinky promise each other every night before bed. No secrets, no staying mad, no giving up on being sisters. The simple wisdom of children never failed to amaze Marcus. In 3 weeks, these 2 little girls had figured out how to build the kind of relationship their mothers had somehow lost along the way. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Marcus answered to find an unfamiliar voice on the other end, an elderly man with a slight southern accent who introduced himself as Judge William Thorne. Mr. Chen, I understand you're seeking to adopt Isabella Martinez, the judge said without preamble. Marcus's stomach dropped. In his experience, judges didn't make personal phone calls unless something was wrong. Yes, sir. Is there a problem with the paperwork? Quite the opposite, Judge Thorne said, and Marcus could hear the smile in his voice. I've been reviewing your case, and frankly it's refreshing to see such a straightforward situation. Too often, these matters get bogged down in red tape and competing interests. But this little girl has no other family making claims. You have a clear connection through marriage, excellent references, and the child's mother left explicit instructions about her wishes for Isabella's care. Marcus sank into a chair, hardly daring to hope. What does that mean exactly? It means I'm prepared to fast-track your adoption petition. Normally this process takes 6 to 8 months, but given the circumstances, I think we can have this finalized within the next few weeks. That is, assuming Isabella is happy with the arrangement. I think she is, Marcus said, glancing toward the kitchen where both girls were attempting to make pancakes and giggling at their failures. But maybe you should ask her yourself. 20 minutes later, Judge Thorne was sitting at their kitchen table, somehow managing to look dignified despite the fact that Emma had insisted on serving him slightly burnt pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Isabella sat beside him with perfect posture, answering his questions with the serious consideration she gave to everything important. Isabella, do you understand what adoption means? Judge Thorne asked kindly. It means Mr. Marcus becomes my Real dad, and Emma becomes my real sister, and I get to stay here forever, even if I'm not perfect, Isabella recited. And is that what you want? Isabella looked around the table at Marcus, who had rescued her from being alone at her mother's funeral, at Emma, who had shared everything from clothes to toys to bedtime stories, at the apartment that was small but warm and full of laughter. Then she looked back at Judge Thorne. "Yes, please," she said simply. "I want to belong somewhere." Judge Thorne nodded and made a note in his file. "Well then, I think we can make that happen. How does 2 weeks from today sound for making it official?" The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and excitement. Marcus found himself constantly amazed by how naturally Isabella had fit into their lives, as if there had always been a space waiting for her that they just hadn't noticed before. Emma threw herself into the role of big sister with characteristic enthusiasm, teaching Isabella everything, from how to ride the bus to school to the proper way to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Isabella, in turn, shared stories about her life with Margaret, helping them all understand the woman who had been too proud to ask for help, but had loved her daughter fiercely. The night before the adoption hearing, Marcus tucked both girls into Emma's room. They had finally convinced him that bunk beds were a necessity, not a luxury. As he turned off the light, Isabella's quiet voice stopped him at the doorway. "Mr. Marcus, you can call me Dad now if you want to," Marcus said gently. "The papers might not be signed yet, but you're already my daughter in every way that matters." There was a pause, and then Isabella's voice came again, softer this time. "Dad?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "Thank you for coming to Mama's funeral. Thank you for being the only one who came." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you for letting me stay." The adoption hearing itself was surprisingly simple. Judge Thorne asked a few formal questions, had Isabella confirm once more that she wanted to be adopted, and then signed the papers that would make their family official. There were no dramatic speeches or tearful moments, just the quiet satisfaction of something important falling into place. Afterward, they celebrated at Isabella's request by going to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. Marcus had worried that it might be too sad, but Isabella had insisted that her mother should know the good news. They brought flowers, daisies, because Isabella said they were her mother's favorites, and stood quietly beside the simple headstone. Marcus and Emma hung back a little, letting Isabella have a private moment with her mother. "Hi, Mama," Isabella said softly, kneeling to place the flowers at the base of the stone. "I wanted you to know that it worked. Your plan worked. Dad found me at the funeral, and now I have a real family. Emma is the best sister ever, and Dad makes pancakes on Sunday mornings, and Mrs. Rodriguez next door teaches me Spanish words." She paused, listening to something only she could hear, then continued, "I know you were worried about leaving me alone, but I'm not alone anymore. And I promise I'll remember all the things you taught me, especially about love getting bigger when you share it." Isabella stood up and brushed the dirt off her knees, then surprised them all by taking Marcus's hand and Emma's hand, forming a small circle beside Margaret's grave. "Mama always said that families are made of love, not just blood," Isabella said. "So even though she's not here anymore, she's still part of our family, and Aunt Sarah too, even though we never got to meet her. They're both part of the love that brought us together." Emma squeezed Isabella's hand. "So we're not just a family of 3, we're a family of 5, with 2 angels watching over us." "Exactly," Isabella said, beaming at her sister's understanding. As they walked back to the car, Marcus reflected on the strange turns life could take. 3 weeks ago, he had been a single father of 1, going through the motions of daily life, unaware that their family was incomplete. Now he was the father of 2 daughters, legal guardian to a little girl, who had lost everything but somehow maintained an unshakable faith in the goodness of people. "Dad," Isabella said from the back seat as they drove home. "Can we have pizza for dinner to celebrate?" "Absolutely," Marcus said, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. "What do you want on it?" "Everything," Isabella said with a grin that lit up her entire face. "I want everything," Marcus laughed, understanding that she wasn't just talking about pizza toppings. Isabella had spent 6 years with very little, and now she wanted to experience everything this new life had to offer. And Marcus was determined to make sure she got exactly that. Everything a child deserved, everything Margaret had wanted for her daughter, everything Sarah would have given her niece if she'd had the chance. As they pulled into their apartment complex, Emma was already making plans for Isabella's first official night as a legally adopted member of their family. There would be movies and popcorn, stories and giggles, and the comfortable chaos of a family settling in for a quiet evening together. Isabella Chen was home at last. 6 months after the adoption, Marcus thought he had figured out the rhythm of their new family life. Isabella had started 2nd grade at Emma's school, where she quickly earned a reputation as the quiet girl who helped struggling classmates with their reading and always shared her lunch with anyone who forgot theirs. Emma had embraced her role as protective big sister with the fierce loyalty of someone who understood what it meant to lose family. But Marcus was about to discover that some chapters of their story were far from finished. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday evening in November. Marcus was helping Isabella with her math homework, while Emma practiced violin in her bedroom, a sound that could charitably be described as enthusiastic rather than melodic. When the phone rang, he almost didn't answer, but something about the persistence of the caller made him pick up. "Is this Marcus Chen?" The voice was unfamiliar, a woman with a crisp, professional tone. "Yes, this is Marcus." "Mr. Chen, my name is Victoria Sterling. I'm calling from the law firm of Sterling, Blackwood and Associates in Denver. I represent the estate of Robert Chen." Marcus froze. Robert Chen had been his father-in-law, Sarah's father, who had died when Emma was barely 2 years old. Sarah had rarely spoken about him, and Marcus had gotten the impression that their relationship had been complicated at best. "I'm sorry," Marcus said carefully, "but Mr. Chen died several years ago. His estate was settled long ago." "Actually, Mr. Chen, that's not entirely accurate. Robert Chen's primary estate was settled, yes, but there were certain irregularities that have only recently come to light. We've been conducting an extensive audit, and we've discovered some assets that were never properly distributed." Isabella looked up from her math worksheet, sensing the tension in Marcus's voice. He gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile and moved to the kitchen for privacy. "What kind of assets?" Marcus asked, though he couldn't imagine why this would matter to their family. Sarah had always said her father had left everything to his business partners. "Mr. Chen, I think this conversation would be better conducted in person. Would it be possible for you to come to Denver next week? I can assure you it would be worth your time." Something in Victoria Sterling's voice made Marcus uneasy. "Ms. Sterling, if this is about money, I should tell you that Sarah and her father weren't close. I doubt he left her anything." "Mr. Chen," Victoria said carefully, "I'm not calling about Sarah's inheritance. I'm calling about Isabella's." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Isabella's mother was Margaret Chen. She wasn't Robert's daughter." "No," Victoria agreed, "but according to our records, Margaret Chen was Robert's daughter-in-law. She was married to his son David." Marcus sank onto a kitchen stool, his mind reeling. "David? Sarah never mentioned a brother named David." "I imagine there's quite a lot Sarah never mentioned, Mr. Chen. The Chen family has a complicated history, but David Chen was Robert's son, and Margaret was David's widow, which makes Isabella Robert Chen's granddaughter and his legal heir to a rather substantial trust fund that was set up specifically for his grandchildren." Marcus felt like the world had tilted sideways. "Miss Sterling, I think there's been some mistake. Isabella's last name was Martinez before I adopted her. That was Margaret's maiden name, which she resumed after David's death. But Isabella was born Isabella Chen, and according to Colorado law, that makes her eligible for her grandfather's inheritance regardless of any subsequent name changes." Marcus's head was spinning. If this was true, if Isabella really was Robert Chen's granddaughter, then that meant Margaret hadn't just been Sarah's sister, she had been Sarah's sister-in-law, which meant the fight between the sisters was even more complicated than Marcus had imagined. "Mr. Chen, are you still there?" "I'm here," Marcus managed. "Miss Sterling, can you tell me what happened to David?" Isabella's never mentioned a father. There was a pause. "Perhaps that's something we should discuss in person. This is a delicate matter, and there are aspects of the family history that are difficult." Marcus looked back toward the living room, where Isabella was still bent over her homework, completely unaware that her world was about to change again. "How much money are we talking about?" "The trust fund, with accumulated interest over the past 6 years, is currently worth approximately $2.3 million. Marcus nearly dropped the phone. "Million? With an M?" "Yes, Mr. Chen. Robert Chen was a very successful businessman, and he was quite specific about wanting to provide for his grandchildren's futures. The trust was set up to be distributed when Isabella turned 18, but given the circumstances, her mother's death and the fact that she's now been adopted, the trustees are prepared to begin distributions immediately for her care and education." Marcus's first instinct was to hang up the phone. This felt too big, too complicated, too much like something that would disrupt the careful stability they'd built. Isabella was happy. She was thriving in school, had made friends, felt secure. For the first time in her young life, did she need to know that she was suddenly an heiress to a fortune from a grandfather she'd never met? But then he thought about Margaret, struggling as a single mother, working multiple jobs to keep their small apartment, rationing medicine because she couldn't afford her full prescriptions. Had she known about this money? Had she chosen not to claim it for some reason? Or had she simply not known it existed? "Miss Sterling," Marcus said finally, "I need to understand something. If this trust fund has existed all along, why wasn't Margaret ever contacted? Why didn't she know about it?" Another pause. "That's one of the irregularities we discovered during our audit. It appears that Robert Chen's original lawyer made some questionable decisions about how to handle David's death and its aftermath. We've only recently gained access to all the relevant documents. Translation: someone had screwed up, and a woman and her child had lived in poverty while money that belonged to them sat in a bank account collecting dust. The injustice of it made Marcus's chest tight with anger. "I'll come to Denver," Marcus said, "but I'm bringing Isabella with me. If this concerns her inheritance, she has a right to understand what's happening." "Mr. Chen, given Isabella's age, perhaps it would be better—" "Miss Sterling," Marcus interrupted firmly, "Isabella has already lost both her parents and been through more upheaval than any 6-year-old should face. I'm not making decisions about her life without her input, and I'm not keeping secrets that affect her future. She comes with me, or we handle this over the phone." A long pause. "Very well. Can you be here Friday afternoon?" After Marcus hung up, he sat in the kitchen for several minutes, trying to process what he'd just learned. Isabella wasn't just Sarah's niece, she was Sarah's brother's daughter, which meant Sarah had lost not just a sister, but a brother too. No wonder she'd carried such heavy grief. No wonder she'd been unable to open those letters from Margaret. "Dad?" Isabella appeared in the kitchen doorway, her math worksheet clutched in one hand. "You look funny. Is everything okay?" Marcus studied her serious little face, those brown eyes that now seemed to carry even more weight than he'd realized. "Isabella, sweetheart, can you come sit with me? There's something we need to talk about. She climbed onto the stool next to him, her expression shifting to the careful alertness she still wore when she sensed that adult conversations might affect her directly. That phone call was from a lawyer in Denver, Marcus began carefully. She told me some things about your family that I didn't know before, things that might be important. Isabella waited patiently, giving him the space to find the right words. It turns out your mama was married to Aunt Sarah's brother. His name was David, and he was your dad. Isabella's eyes widened. I had a dad? Mama never told me about a dad. Sometimes parents don't talk about people who aren't with us anymore because it makes them too sad, Marcus explained. But yes, you had a father, and he was part of Aunt Sarah's family. What happened to him? Marcus realized he didn't know the answer to that question, and it bothered him more than he could say. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to find out. The lawyer wants us to come to Denver so she can explain everything. Are we in trouble? Isabella asked, and Marcus's heart clenched at the worry in her voice. No, Isabella, we're not in trouble. Actually, it's the opposite. It turns out your grandfather, your dad's father, left some money for you. Quite a lot of money. Isabella processed this with her characteristic thoughtfulness. How much money? Enough that you'll never have to worry about having a place to live or food to eat or clothes to wear. Enough to pay for college and anything else you might want to do when you grow up. But I already have those things, Isabella said, confused. I have you and Emma and our apartment and Mrs. Rodriguez's cooking lessons. Marcus smiled, reminded once again that Isabella's understanding of wealth had nothing to do with money. You're right. You do have all the important things. This money doesn't change any of that. It just means you have even more choices about your future. Isabella was quiet for a moment, then asked, Does this mean we have to move to Denver? No, sweetheart. This is your home. We're just going to visit for a few days to learn more about your family and make sure the money is handled properly. Can Emma come too? Of course Emma's coming. We're a family. We stick together. That Friday, the three of them flew to Denver, Isabella's first time on an airplane, which provided a welcome distraction from the weightier reasons for their trip. Emma appointed herself as Isabella's tour guide to air travel, explaining everything from seat belts to altitude changes with the authority of someone who had flown exactly twice in her life. Victoria Sterling's law office was intimidating. All marble floors and mahogany furniture that spoke of serious money and serious consequences. But Victoria herself was warmer than her phone manner had suggested, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a genuine smile when she saw Isabella. You must be Isabella, Victoria said, crouching down to Isabella's eye level. I can see the family resemblance. You have your father's eyes. Isabella moved a step closer to Marcus. Did you know my dad? I knew your grandfather better, but yes, I met your father a few times when he was younger. He was a good man who loved your mother very much. Victoria led them to a conference room where she had assembled what looked like a small mountain of paperwork, photographs, and documents. Marcus felt overwhelmed just looking at it all, but Isabella approached the table with curiosity rather than apprehension. Can you tell us what happened to David? Marcus asked, once they were all seated. Victoria's expression grew sad. David Chen died in a car accident when Isabella was 6 months old. He and Margaret were driving home from a family gathering when they were hit by a drunk driver. Margaret survived, but David didn't. Isabella absorbed this information quietly. So my dad died when I was a baby. Yes, sweetheart, you were too young to remember him, but he loved you very much. Your grandfather told me that David used to carry your picture everywhere and talk about all the things he wanted to teach you when you got older. Victoria pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed a young man who looked remarkably like an older version of Emma, holding a tiny baby with Isabella's serious dark eyes. The joy on his face was unmistakable. "That's you and your daddy," Victoria said gently. "This was taken about a week before the accident." Isabella studied the photograph with intense concentration, as if she could somehow pull memories out of the image through sheer force of will. "He looks happy." "He was. You made him very happy." "What about the money?" Marcus asked. "Why didn't Margaret know about it?" Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "That's where things get complicated. Robert Chen's original attorney, Harold Blackwood, my former partner, made some decisions after David's death that were ethically questionable. He told Robert that Margaret had refused the inheritance and wanted nothing to do with the Chen family. That wasn't true. We don't believe so. We think Harold was acting on his own prejudices. Margaret was young, Hispanic, from a working-class family. Harold was old school, and I suspect he didn't think she was appropriate for the Chen family fortune. Marcus felt his anger rising. So he lied to both of them? Let Robert think Margaret had rejected the family and never told Margaret the money existed. That's what our investigation suggests. Harold died 2 years ago, and when I took over his cases, I found irregularities in several estate files. Robert Chen was one of them. Isabella had been following the conversation with the sharp attention she gave to all important adult discussions. Now she spoke up, her voice clear and determined. "So my mama didn't know about the money. She didn't choose to not take it." "No, Isabella. Your mother never knew it existed. If she had, I think she would have claimed it for your sake, even if she didn't want it for herself." Isabella nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already known. "Mama always said we had enough, but sometimes I knew we didn't really. Like when she would eat just soup for dinner and say she wasn't hungry, or when she would wear her coat inside because the heater was broken." Marcus's heart broke a little more. Margaret had struggled and sacrificed, while money that belonged to her daughter sat untouched in a bank account, all because of one man's bigotry and lies. "Well," Victoria said, "we can't change the past, but we can make sure Isabella's future is secure. The trust fund will cover all her expenses, education, housing, medical care, anything she needs. And when she turns 18, she'll have full control over what remains." "What about now?" Marcus asked. "I mean, Isabella's been legally adopted. Does that change anything?" "Not at all. The trust was set up for Robert's grandchildren, regardless of their circumstances. Adoption doesn't affect bloodline inheritance. Rights in this case. Isabella had been studying the photograph of her father throughout this conversation. Now she looked up at Victoria with a question that surprised everyone. "Was my grandfather angry at Mama? Is that why we never met him?" Victoria exchanged a glance with Marcus before answering. "Isabella, your grandfather died when you were 3 years old. He never knew that your mother hadn't rejected the family. He spent the last years of his life believing that his son's widow wanted nothing to do with him. So he was sad too," Isabella said, with the insight that continued to amaze the adults around her. "Everyone was sad and alone because of the lies." "Yes," Victoria said softly, "everyone lost something they didn't have to lose." As they left the law office that afternoon, Marcus felt overwhelmed by the tragedy of it all. So many years of unnecessary separation, so much pain that could have been avoided if one man hadn't decided he knew what was best for everyone else. But as they walked through downtown Denver, Isabella slipped her hand into his and said something that shifted his perspective. "Dad, can we do something good with the money, something that would make my dad and my grandfather proud?" "What did you have in mind, sweetheart?" Isabella was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Maybe we could help other kids who don't have families, or maybe we could make sure lawyers don't lie to people anymore." Emma, who had been unusually quiet throughout the legal discussions, suddenly perked up. "We could start a foundation, like the ones that help kids find homes," Marcus looked at his daughters, both of them now, officially and completely his daughters, and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the kind of people they were becoming. "I think," he said, "that's exactly what your father and grandfather would want. Money should be used to bring families together, not keep them apart." As they headed back to their hotel, Marcus realized that once again their family was about to change. But this time, they were ready for it. This time, they would write their own story about what family means and how love multiplies when you share it with others who need it most. Isabella Chen might be an heiress now, but more importantly, she was still the little girl who had whispered, "You're the only one who came," at her mother's funeral. And she was determined to make sure no other child would ever have to say those words again. 2 years after the Denver revelation, Marcus stood in the hallway of Lincoln Elementary School, watching through the classroom window as Isabella presented her third-grade science project. She had chosen to study metamorphosis, how caterpillars transform into butterflies, and was explaining to her classmates with characteristic seriousness that sometimes the biggest changes come from the inside out. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had called Marcus that morning with an unusual request. She wanted to discuss Isabella's academic performance, but not for the reasons he'd feared. Isabella was testing at a 6th grade level in reading and 5th grade in mathematics. She was helping other students with their work, creating elaborate stories during creative writing time, and asking questions that challenged even Mrs. Patterson's understanding of science and nature. "She's what we call profoundly gifted," Mrs. Patterson explained, as they sat in tiny plastic chairs meant for 8-year-olds. "I've been teaching for 22 years, and I've never seen a child with Isabella's combination of intellectual ability and emotional intelligence." Marcus felt a familiar mix of pride and worry. What does that mean for her education? "Well, we have several options. We could skip her ahead a grade or two, though I'm always cautious about that because social development is so important. Or we could keep her with her age group, but provide enrichment activities. There's also a specialized program for highly gifted children at Roosevelt Academy across town." Marcus glanced back through the window, where Isabella was now helping a classmate who seemed confused about the butterfly life cycle. She wasn't showing off or acting superior. She was genuinely trying to help someone understand something that fascinated her. "What would you recommend?" Marcus asked. "Honestly, I'd recommend talking to Isabella. She's mature enough to have input on her own education, and she understands herself better than most adults understand themselves." That evening, Marcus brought up the conversation at dinner. Emma, now 10, and in 5th grade herself, immediately had opinions. "Isabella's already smarter than half the kids in my grade," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Remember when she helped me with my math homework and explained it better than my teacher did?" Isabella looked uncomfortable with the attention. "I just read a lot," she said quietly, "and I like learning new things." "Isabella," Marcus said gently, "Mrs. Patterson thinks you might be happier in a different kind of school. One with other kids who learn the same way you do." Isabella's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Would I have to leave Emma?" "The schools are different, so yes, you'd go to different places during the day, but you'd still live here, still be sisters, still be family." Isabella considered this with her usual thoughtfulness. "Would the other kids at this new school be like me?" "What do you mean, sweetheart? Would they understand what it's like to lose people? Or would they all have perfect families and think I'm weird because I remember too much?" Marcus felt his heart clench. Isabella rarely talked about the trauma of losing her mother, but it was always there, shaping how she saw the world. Her intelligence was just one part of who she was. She was also a child who had experienced profound loss and found her way to healing through love and stability. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. But wherever you go to school, you'll still be you, and we'll still be your family. That doesn't change." Isabella nodded slowly. "Can I visit the new school before deciding? I want to see if it feels right." The Roosevelt Academy was unlike any school Marcus had ever seen. The classrooms looked more like workshops or laboratories, with flexible seating arrangements and walls covered in student projects that ranged from simple drawings to complex mathematical proofs. Children of various ages worked together on collaborative projects, and the energy was focused but relaxed. Their tour guide was Dr. Amanda Foster, the school's director, who had the rare gift of speaking to children as intellectual equals without talking down to them. She explained the school's philosophy to Isabella directly. "We believe that learning should match the learner," Dr. Foster said, as they walked through a classroom where a group of students were building a working model of the solar system. "Some children need to move fast through material they grasp quickly. Others need to dive deep into subjects that capture their imagination. Our job is to figure out what each student needs and provide it." Isabella watched the students with keen interest. They ranged in age from what looked like kindergarten to middle school, all working together on different aspects of the same project. A girl who couldn't have been older than 6 was calculating orbital periods, while a boy, maybe 12 years old, was explaining gravitational forces to a mixed age group. "Do the older kids mind helping the younger ones?" Isabella asked. "Do you mind helping Emma with her homework?" Dr. Foster countered with a smile. "No, but Emma's my sister. These kids are strangers." "Not for long," said a voice behind them. They turned to see a boy about Isabella's age, with bright red hair and an infectious grin. "I'm Tyler, and I've been here since kindergarten. We're all weird here, so nobody feels weird." Isabella studied Tyler with the same careful attention she gave to everything new. "What kind of weird are you?" "I read college-level physics books. For fun, I can solve a Rubik's Cube in under 30 seconds, and I collect vintage lunchboxes," Tyler said cheerfully. "What kind of weird are you?" For the first time since they'd arrived, Isabella smiled, really smiled, not the polite expression she wore for adults, but the genuine delight she usually reserved for family. "I memorize poetry and recite it when I'm nervous. I can identify birds by their calls, and I think about death more than most kids probably should," Isabella said. "Cool," Tyler said without missing a beat. "Want to see our library? We have a whole section on thanatology. That's the study of death and dying. Really fascinating stuff." As Tyler led Isabella away, chattering about the school's research projects and collaborative learning model, Dr. Foster turned to Marcus. "She'll fit in perfectly here," she said. "We have several students who've experienced significant trauma or loss. They often have unusual depth and insight that their age peers can't relate to." Marcus watched Isabella deep in conversation with Tyler, her usual careful reserve melting away as she found someone who didn't think her interests were strange or her questions too serious. "What about the social aspects?" Marcus asked. "She's very close to her sister, and I worry about them being separated during the day. We encourage family connections," Dr. Foster assured him. "Many of our students have siblings at other schools. We work around family schedules, and we have several programs where older siblings can visit or participate in special events." By the time they left Roosevelt Academy, Isabella had made 3 new friends, signed up for an astronomy club, and asked if she could start the following Monday. The transformation was remarkable. Marcus hadn't realized how much Isabella had been holding herself back at her regular school until he saw her fully engaged with intellectual peers. But the decision wasn't just about academics. That night, as Marcus tucked both girls into their beds, Isabella had finally agreed to the bunk bed arrangement, with Emma on top and Isabella on the bottom. Emma brought up the elephant in the room. "If Isabella goes to the smart kids' school, will she still want to hang out with me?" Emma asked. Her voice smaller than usual, Isabella immediately sat up in her bottom bunk. "Emma, You're my sister. That means forever, no matter what school I go to or how many new friends I make. But what if the smart kids think I'm boring? Isabella climbed out of her bed and sat on the edge of Emma's. Emma, do you know what I told Tyler today when he asked about my family? Emma shook her head. I told him that my sister Emma is the bravest person I know, because she makes friends easily and stands up for kids who get picked on, and she's not afraid to try new things even when she might fail. I told him that you're funny and kind, and you make me laugh when I'm being too serious. Emma's worried expression began to soften. The kids at Roosevelt might know a lot about math and science, Isabella continued, but you know a lot about people and friendship and how to make others feel included. That's not less important. It's different. Marcus felt a surge of pride as he watched his daughters navigate this challenge together. Isabella's intellectual gifts were remarkable, but her emotional intelligence was what made her truly special. Besides, Isabella added with a grin, who's going to help me remember to eat lunch if you're not there to remind me? And who's going to tell me when I'm explaining things in a way that sounds like I'm bragging? Emma giggled. You do forget to eat when you're thinking hard about stuff. Exactly. I need you to keep me balanced. Isabella did start at Roosevelt Academy the following Monday, and the change was immediate and dramatic. She came home each day bubbling with excitement about projects and discoveries, challenging Marcus with questions he had to research to answer, and working on assignments that looked more like graduate-level research than elementary school homework. But more importantly, she remained grounded in their family life. She still helped Emma with homework, still participated in their weekend movie nights, still called Marcus Dad in the tone that said he was the most important person in her world. Financial resources from her inheritance had made Isabella's specialized education possible without strain, but Marcus was careful to ensure that money didn't change their core values. They still lived in the same apartment, still shipped carefully, still talked about the importance of gratitude and generosity. In fact, Isabella's inheritance had led to one of their most meaningful family projects. With Victoria Sterling's help, they established the David and Margaret Chen Foundation, focused on ensuring that children in foster care had access to educational opportunities and that families separated by bureaucratic errors could find each other. Isabella had insisted on being involved in the foundation's work despite her young age. She wrote letters to children in foster care, helped organize fundraising events, and used her research skills to identify programs that needed support. She had also insisted that they fund a position for someone to audit estate cases like Harold Blackwood's to prevent other families from being torn apart by prejudice and lies. Money is just a tool, Isabella had explained to a reporter who was writing about the foundation. It can't bring back the people we've lost, but it can help make sure other kids don't lose people they shouldn't have to lose. The reporter had been amazed by Isabella's articulate responses and mature perspective. The resulting article had brought even more attention to their foundation's work, leading to partnerships with larger organizations and increased funding for their programs. But despite all the external recognition and opportunities, Isabella's favorite parts of her life remained simple: reading with Emma before bed, helping Marcus cook dinner on Sunday afternoons, and the quiet moments when they sat together as a family, grateful for how love had multiplied and grown in ways none of them could have imagined. One evening, as Marcus was reviewing foundation paperwork while the girls worked on their respective homework assignments, Isabella looked up from her astronomy charts. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always, sweetheart." "Do you think Mama and Aunt Sarah would be proud of what we're doing with the foundation and helping other families?" Marcus set down his papers and really looked at his daughter. This remarkable child who had lost so much but somehow remained focused on helping others, who had inherited wealth but thought of it as responsibility rather than privilege. Isabella, I think your mama and Aunt Sarah and your father and your grandfather are all incredibly proud. But more than that, I think they're amazed by who you've become. We, Isabella corrected gently, who we've become. None of this would work if it was just me, and that, Marcus realized, was exactly the point. Isabella's gifts, intellectual, emotional, and financial, were remarkable, but what made their family special was how they used those gifts together, how they supported each other, how they had taken their individual losses and transformed them into collective healing. As he watched Isabella return to her star charts and Emma work on her creative writing assignment, Marcus reflected on how much their lives had changed since that rainy day at Margaret's funeral. They had started as strangers bound by tragedy and had become a family bound by love, purpose, and an unshakable commitment to ensuring that no child would ever have to face loss alone. Isabella might be academically gifted, but her greatest gift was her understanding that intelligence without compassion was meaningless, that wealth without generosity was empty, and that family wasn't about blood or law, but about showing up when it mattered most, and they would keep showing up for each other and for all the children who needed someone to whisper, "You're not alone anymore." 4 years had passed since the funeral that changed everything, and Isabella was now 10 years old, academically working at a high school level, but emotionally still very much a child who needed bedtime stories and reassurance after thunderstorms. The balance between nurturing her gifts and protecting her childhood had become Marcus's greatest challenge as a parent. It was a crisp October morning when everything shifted again, starting with an unexpected visitor at their apartment door. Marcus opened it to find a woman in her 70s, silver-haired and elegant, with eyes that looked remarkably familiar. "Mr. Chen?" she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor of nervousness. "My name is Elena Rodriguez. I believe you adopted my great niece." Marcus felt the world tilt sideways, just as it had during that phone call from Victoria Sterling years earlier. "I'm sorry. What?" "Isabella Martinez," Elena continued, clutching a worn leather purse against her chest. "Her mother was Margaret. Margaret was my niece, my brother Carlos's daughter." Marcus gripped the doorframe, his mind racing. "But Margaret's maiden name was Chen, not Martinez." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "No, Mr. Chen, Margaret's maiden name was Martinez. She changed it to Chen when she married David, but before that she was Margaret Elena Martinez, named after me." Emma appeared at Marcus's shoulder, drawn by the commotion. "Dad, who is this lady?" I'm not sure yet," Marcus admitted, still trying to process what Eleanor was saying. "Is Isabella here?" Eleanor asked softly. "I've been looking for her for so long. When Margaret died, the social services people told me there was no family, but I knew that couldn't be right. I've been searching through court records and adoption files for 4 years." Isabella emerged from her bedroom, having heard her name. She took one look at Elena and went very still, her expression shifting to the careful watchfulness she still used when faced with potentially life-changing adult conversations. "Isabella," Elena whispered, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Mija, you look so much like your mother when she was your age." "Who are you?" Isabella asked quietly, moving closer to Marcus. "I'm your great-aunt Elena. Your abuela Maria was my sister. Your mama was like my own daughter after your grandparents died." Marcus felt like he was drowning in information that didn't fit with what he thought he knew about Isabella's background. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I think there's been some confusion. Isabella's mother's family name was Chen, not Martinez." Elena shook her head sadly. "Margaret took David's name when they married, but she grew up Margaret Martinez. Her parents, my brother, Carlos, and his wife Maria died when Margaret was 16. I raised her from then until she married David. Isabella had been listening with the intense focus she brought to all important information. Now she spoke up, her voice small but clear. Mama said her parents died when she was young, but she never told me their names. She said talking about them made her too sad. Your mama was protecting herself, Eleanor explained gently. When your parents died in that car crash with David, she was so broken with grief that she couldn't bear to stay connected to anything that reminded her of more loss. She moved away, changed back to her married name instead of returning to Martinez, and told me she needed to start fresh. Marcus invited Elena inside, his mind spinning with the implications. If Elena was telling the truth, then Isabella had a family she'd never known about. Not just one great aunt, but potentially cousins, extended family, a whole cultural heritage that had been lost when Margaret made the difficult choice to cut ties with her past. Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus said carefully as they settled in the living room, if you've been Isabella's family all along, why didn't you come forward when Margaret died? Why weren't social services able to find you? Elena's expression darkened. Because Margaret legally changed her name and moved across state lines. When she filed Isabella's birth certificate, she listed her maiden name as Chen, not Martinez. The social workers were looking for Chen family members, not Martinez ones. And Margaret had been so determined to sever ties that she never updated her emergency contacts or left any trail back to us. Isabella climbed onto the couch next to Marcus, seeking the comfort of familiar touch while processing this information. So Mama had a family, but she was too sad to talk to them? Yes, mija. Your Mama loved us. But sometimes when people are carrying too much grief, they think the only way to survive is to start completely over. Emma, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, now joined them. So Isabella has even more family than we thought? Eleanor smiled through her tears. Isabella has cousins and second cousins and great-uncles. She has a family that speaks Spanish and makes tamales at Christmas and tells stories about where we came from. She has a heritage that her mama was too heartbroken to share, but always meant to pass down someday. Marcus watched Isabella process this information, seeing the familiar mix of curiosity and caution that she brought to all new situations. Isabella, how do you feel about this? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, then asked Elena, "Did you love my mama?" "More than anything in the world," Elena replied without hesitation. "When her parents died, I promised them I would take care of her. When she married David, I was so happy because she'd found someone who made her laugh again. When David died and she pushed us all away, it broke my heart, but I understood. Sometimes survival means making hard choices. And you've been looking for me every day for 4 years. I hired private investigators, searched through court records, contacted every social service agency in 3 states. When I finally found the adoption records, I was so relieved to know you were safe and loved." Isabella looked at Marcus with a question in her eyes. "Does this change anything about us being a family?" Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Isabella, nothing could ever change the fact that you're my daughter and Emma's sister. But this means you have even more people who love you. That's not a complication, that's a gift." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a thick photo album. "I brought pictures if you'd like to see them. Pictures of your mama when she was little, your grandparents, your cousins, who are excited to meet you." Isabella moved closer to Elena, drawn by the promise of images of her mother's childhood. As Elena opened the album, Isabella's breath caught. The first page showed a little girl who looked exactly like Isabella, standing between a man and woman who were clearly her parents. The resemblance was unmistakable. Isabella had inherited not just Margaret's eyes, but her smile, her serious expression, even the way she tilted her head when thinking. "That's your mama when she was about your age," Elena said softly. "And those are your abuelos, Carlos and Maria. They would have been so proud of the brilliant, kind girl you've become." Isabella traced the photograph with one finger. "Mama never showed me pictures of them. I always wondered what they looked like." Elena turned the page to reveal more photos. Margaret as a teenager, helping in what looked like a family restaurant. Margaret at her high school graduation beaming with pride. Margaret on her wedding day with David, both of them radiant with happiness. "Your parents met at the restaurant," Elena explained. "David came in one day for lunch and asked your mama for her phone number. She was so flustered she gave him the number for the pizza place next door by mistake." Despite the emotional weight of the moment, Isabella giggled, the first genuinely carefree sound she'd made since Elena arrived. "That sounds like something Mama would do. She was always mixing up numbers." Emma leaned over to see the pictures. "Isabella, your mom looked just like you when she was little. But you look like your dad too, see? You have his nose." Marcus found himself studying these glimpses into Margaret's life before tragedy struck. The young woman in these photos looked happy, surrounded by family, embedded in a community and culture that had shaped her. It made her later isolation even more heartbreaking. "Elena," Marcus said carefully, "I want Isabella to know her family and her heritage. But I also want to make sure this transition is handled in a way that feels safe for her. She's been through a lot of changes." Elena nodded immediately. "Of course. I don't want to overwhelm her or disrupt the beautiful life you've built together. I just want to be part of it if she'll have me." Isabella had been studying a photograph of Margaret surrounded by what looked like dozens of relatives at a family celebration. "Are all these people my family too?" "Every single one," Eleanor confirmed. "Cousins and aunts and uncles who've been waiting to meet you, but only when you're ready, Mija, only when it feels right." Isabella looked at Marcus, then at Emma, then back at Elena. "Can we start slowly? Like, maybe you could come to dinner sometimes and tell me stories about Mama when she was little?" "I would love that more than anything," Elena said, tears starting again. "And maybe you could teach me to make those tamales you mentioned. Mama never learned to cook Mexican food because she left home so young." Elena's face lit up with joy. "Isabella, I will teach you every recipe your bisabuela taught me, every tradition your mama was too sad to share. We'll cook together, and I'll tell you stories about where you come from." Marcus felt a familiar stirring of the same instinct that had made him approach Isabella at Margaret's funeral, the recognition that this was right, that the family had once again found a way to connect across loss and time and misunderstanding. "There's something else," Elena said hesitantly, "something I bought for you if you want it." She reached into her purse again and pulled out a small wooden box, similar to the one that had started this whole journey, but older, more worn. "This belonged to your bisabuela, your great-grandmother. She always said it should go to the youngest girl in each generation." Isabella accepted the box with reverent care, opening it to reveal a delicate silver cross on a chain, clearly very old and precious. But underneath the cross was something even more meaningful, a small notebook filled with handwritten recipes in Spanish, with notes in the margins in multiple handwritings. "Those are family recipes," Elena explained, "written by your bisabuela, with notes added by your abuela Maria and some by your mama when she was learning to cook. It's a record of our family's traditions, passed down from mother to daughter for generations." Isabella held the notebook as if it were made of glass. "Mama tried to teach me some cooking, but we didn't have many ingredients, and she said she couldn't remember her mother's recipes exactly. Now you have them all," Elena said simply, "and you have me to help you learn them." That evening, after Elena had left with promises to return on Sunday for their first cooking lesson, Marcus found Isabella, sitting in her bed, carefully studying the recipe notebook with a Spanish-English dictionary beside her. "How are you feeling about all this, sweetheart?" Marcus asked, settling on the edge of her bed. Isabella looked up with eyes that held wonder rather than worry. "It's like finding out there's a whole other room in our house that we never knew existed. A room full of people who loved Mama and want to love me too. Are you worried about anything?" Isabella considered this with her usual thoughtfulness. "A little. What if they expect me to be someone I'm not? What if they're disappointed that I don't speak Spanish or know about their traditions? Isabella, you are exactly who you're supposed to be. The family that loves you, all of us, love you for who you are, not for who we think you should become." "Even if I'm more interested in astronomy than tamales," Marcus laughed. "Especially then. Besides, maybe you'll discover you can be interested in both." Emma appeared in the doorway, ready for their nightly ritual of reading together. "Isabella, can I learn to make tamales too? I want to know about your family traditions." Isabella beamed at her sister. "Of course, Tia Elena said family isn't just about blood, it's about people who choose to love each other. That makes you my sister in every tradition that matters." As Marcus tucked both girls in that night, he reflected on how their definition of family kept expanding in ways he never could have predicted. First, Isabella had joined them. Then they discovered her connection to Sarah's family and the inheritance that came with it. Now Elena and the Martinez family had appeared, bringing with them cultural heritage and traditions that would enrich Isabella's understanding of herself. But through all these changes, the core remained constant. They were people who chose to love each other, who showed up when it mattered, who turned loss into connection and isolation into belonging. Isabella might have started as the little girl who whispered, "You're the only one who came," at her mother's funeral, but now she was, surrounded by family, biological, legal, chosen and found. And Marcus realized that maybe that had been the point all along. Not just to rescue Isabella from loneliness, but to discover that love really does multiply when you share it, creating families in ways that transcend blood, law, or tradition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and discoveries, but tonight they were exactly where they belonged, together, safe, and surrounded by a love that had grown far beyond what any of them had imagined possible. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, in March, just as Isabella was finishing her advanced calculus homework before school. She was now 11, academically ready for college-level coursework, but still young enough to sleep with the stuffed elephant Emma had given her on their first night together. Marcus had learned to navigate these contrasts, protecting her childhood, while nurturing her extraordinary mind. "Mr. Chen," the voice on the phone was professional but warm. "This is Dr. Sarah Kim from the National Science Foundation. I'm calling about Isabella's research proposal." Marcus nearly dropped his coffee mug. "I'm sorry, what research proposal?" "The paper she submitted to our Young Investigator program last month. Her work on mathematical models for predicting butterfly migration patterns. It's quite remarkable for someone her age." Marcus looked across the kitchen at Isabella, who was carefully packing her backpack with the methodical precision she brought to everything. She caught his stare and raised an eyebrow in question. "Dr. Kim, I think there might be some mistake. Isabella hasn't submitted any research proposals that I'm aware of." "Actually, Dad," Isabella said quietly, having heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening, "I did submit something. I just didn't think it would be selected for anything important." Dr. Kim continued, "Mr. Chen, Isabella's work demonstrates graduate-level understanding of complex mathematical concepts applied to ecological systems. We'd like to invite her to present her findings at our national conference this summer. She would be the youngest presenter in the program's history." After Marcus hung up, he sat Isabella down for a conversation that felt both proud and overwhelming. "Isabella, when did you write a research paper?" And how did you even know such programs existed? Isabella's cheeks flushed pink. I've been working on it during my free periods at school. Dr. Foster helped me understand the submission process. She said it was important to share discoveries, even small ones. Isabella, this isn't a small discovery. The National Science Foundation wants you to present at their conference. Do you understand how significant that is? Isabella shrugged, uncomfortable with praise as always. I just noticed patterns in the butterfly migration data from our schools. Nature Preserve. When I applied the mathematical models we've been studying, I found some correlations that hadn't been documented before. Emma, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the kitchen. Isabella, this is amazing. You're going to be famous. I don't want to be famous, Isabella said quickly. I just wanted to understand why some butterflies choose different paths than others. Marcus studied his daughter's face, recognizing the anxiety beneath her calm exterior. Fame and attention had always made Isabella uncomfortable. She preferred working quietly, sharing her discoveries with small groups of trusted people rather than seeking recognition. Isabella, you don't have to present if you don't want to, Marcus said gently. This is your choice. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, thinking, Can I ask you something, Dad? Always. When you decided to come to Mama's funeral, even though you didn't know me, were you scared? The question caught Marcus off guard. Terrified, he admitted. I had no idea what I was walking into or whether I was doing the right thing, but you did it anyway because you thought it might help someone. Yes, Isabella nodded slowly. Then I think I should present my research. Not because I want people to think I'm smart, but because maybe understanding butterfly migration better could help with conservation efforts. Maybe it could help someone. Marcus felt the familiar surge of pride mixed with protectiveness that Isabella's wisdom always brought. At 11, she already understood that knowledge was responsibility, that gifts were meant to be shared in service of something larger than oneself. The months leading up to the conference were a whirlwind of preparation. Isabella worked with Dr. Foster to refine her presentation, practiced explaining complex concepts in accessible language, and collaborated with actual university researchers who were amazed by her insights. But the most meaningful preparation happened at home, in the quiet moments when the family gathered to support Isabella through her nervousness about public speaking. Elena had become a regular presence in their lives, bringing not just tamales and family stories, but a grandmother's instinct for when a child needed extra comfort. Mija, Elena said one evening, as Isabella practiced her presentation for the dozenth time, do you know what your bisabuela used to say about butterflies? Isabella looked up from her notes, always ready for one of Elena's stories that somehow contained exactly the wisdom she needed. She said that butterflies teach us that transformation isn't just about becoming something new. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be, but couldn't be until you were ready. Isabella considered this. So the caterpillar doesn't become a different creature. It becomes itself, just in a form that can fly? Exactly. And you, presenting your research to all those scientists, you're not becoming someone different. You're just becoming yourself in a form that can reach more people. The night before they left for the conference, Marcus found Isabella sitting on her bed, surrounded by papers and charts, but not actually working. She was holding the wooden box Elena had given her, running her fingers over the worn surface. Nervous? Marcus asked, settling beside her. A little. What if I forget what to say? What if my research isn't as good as I think it is? What if the other scientists think I'm just a kid playing at being smart? Marcus wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Isabella, do you remember what you told me about why you wanted to do this research? To help someone. To maybe contribute to conservation efforts. That's still true, no matter how old you are or what anyone thinks of you personally. Your research either contributes valuable information or it doesn't. Your age doesn't change the quality of your work. Isabella leaned against his shoulder. I keep thinking about Mama. She was so smart, but she never got the chance to go to college or pursue research or anything like that. Sometimes I feel guilty that I have opportunities she never had. Marcus felt his heart clench. Isabella rarely talked about survivor's guilt, but he'd learned to recognize the signs. Isabella, do you think your mama would want you to limit yourself because she couldn't pursue her dreams? No, Isabella said immediately. She always said education was the one thing no one could take away from you. Then honor her by using every opportunity you have. Don't diminish your light because hers was cut short. Shine brighter because she can't. The conference was held at a major university, and Isabella was indeed the youngest presenter by decades. Marcus watched from the audience as she took the stage in front of 300 researchers, environmental scientists, and policymakers, looking impossibly small behind the podium, but speaking with quiet authority about migration patterns, mathematical modeling, and conservation implications. She handled questions from professors and researchers with poise, admitting when she didn't know something, but also defending her methodology when challenged. When one older scientist suggested her age made her findings less credible, Isabella responded with a calm professionalism that made Marcus's chest swell with pride. "Sir, I understand your skepticism about my age," Isabella said clearly. "But mathematics doesn't care how old the person applying it is. Either my calculations are correct or they're not. Either my observations are accurate or they're not. I'd be happy to walk through my methodology with you after the presentation so you can verify my work independently." The audience actually applauded, and the skeptical scientist looked somewhat sheepish. After Isabella's presentation, she was surrounded by researchers wanting to discuss collaborations, graduate programs, and potential mentorships. But the moment that mattered most came that evening, when Isabella called Elena from their hotel room. "Tia, Elena, I did it," Isabella said, her voice glowing with quiet satisfaction. "I presented my research and people listened, and they think it might actually help protect butterfly habitats." Elena's voice came through the speaker warm, with pride. "Mija, your mama and your bisabuela and all the women who came before you, they're all proud tonight. You carried their strength with you up to that podium. Over the following months, Isabella's research led to real-world applications. Environmental groups began using her mathematical models to predict migration patterns and plan conservation efforts. She was invited to consult on habitat protection projects and collaborate with university research teams, but Isabella insisted on balancing her scientific work with family life and her foundation activities. She still helped Emma with homework, still participated in their Sunday cooking sessions with Elena, still made time for the quiet moments that kept her grounded. The foundation had grown significantly, now helping dozens of children navigate the foster care system and funding programs that prevented families from being separated by bureaucratic failures. Isabella took particular pride in a program that provided educational advocates for gifted children in foster care, ensuring that brilliant kids didn't slip through cracks in the system. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't come to Mama's funeral," Isabella told Marcus one evening as they worked together on foundation paperwork. "Not just to me, but to all the kids we're helping now. One person showing up when no one else does, it creates ripples that spread so much further than anyone expects." Marcus looked at his daughter, this remarkable young woman who had transformed from a lonely child at a funeral into a scientist making real contributions to conservation efforts, a philanthropist helping vulnerable children, and a family member who brought joy and wisdom to everyone around her. Isabella, I need you to know something, Marcus said seriously. I didn't save you that day at the funeral. We saved each other. Emma and I were going through the motions of life, but you brought purpose and meaning back to everything we do. Isabella smiled, not the careful, controlled expression she used in public, but the radiant joy she reserved for family. So we're all butterflies then. We transformed each other into who we were meant to be. That night, as Marcus tucked both girls into their beds, they had finally outgrown the bunk bed phase but still preferred to be in the same room. He reflected on the journey that had started with a little girl whispering, "You're the only one," who came. Isabella no longer believed she was alone in the world. She was surrounded by family, Marcus and Emma, Elena and the Martinez relatives, the scientific community that had embraced her work, the children helped by their foundation, the teachers and mentors who guided her development. She had become the center of an expanding network of love and support that grew stronger every day. But more than that, Isabella had learned to be someone others could count on. She showed up for Emma's school performances, for Eleanor's doctor, appointments, for foundation events where former foster children shared their success stories. She had internalized the lesson that family isn't about who comes to you when things are easy. It's about who shows up when showing up matters most. As Marcus turned off the lights and headed to his own room, he could hear the girls whispering, together, sharing secrets, making plans, supporting each other through the ordinary anxieties of growing up. It was a sound that never failed to fill him with gratitude for that rainy day when he decided to attend the funeral of a stranger and found the missing pieces of his family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight they were exactly where they belonged. Together, surrounded by love that had multiplied far beyond what any of them had imagined possible, secure in the knowledge that they would always show up for each other, no matter what the future might hold. 10 years after that rainy funeral, Isabella stood at another cemetery, but this time she wasn't alone. At 16, she had just graduated high school and been accepted to MIT on a full research scholarship. Emma, now 18 and headed to art school, stood beside her. Marcus held the hands of their newest family member, 8-year-old Carlos, a boy they'd met through the foundation who had lost his parents in an accident and had no other family to claim him. They were visiting Margaret's grave on the anniversary of her death, a tradition they'd maintained every year. But today felt different. Final, somehow, like the completion of a circle that had been 10 years in the making. "Mama," Isabella said softly, placing fresh daisies on the headstone. "I wanted you to know that your plan worked better than you ever could have imagined. Not only did I find Dad and Emma, but we've found each other again and again in ways you never could have predicted." She gestured to the small crowd gathered around the grave. Eleanor was there, of course, now in her 80s, but still spry enough to make tamales every Sunday. Tyler from Roosevelt Academy had become Isabella's closest friend and research partner, currently developing climate models, while Isabella focused on conservation biology. Dr. Foster stood nearby, having become more like a grandmother than a former teacher. Even Victoria Sterling had driven up from Denver, the lawyer who had become an honorary aunt after helping them navigate the complexities of inherited wealth and family foundations. But the most meaningful addition was Carlos, whose story had echoed Isabella's own in heartbreaking ways. He'd been 7 when his parents died, old enough to understand loss, but young enough to desperately need family. When Isabella learned about his situation through their foundation, she'd immediately asked if they could help him the way Marcus had once helped her. "I know what it's like," Isabella had told Marcus when she first suggested they consider adopting Carlos. "I know how it feels to sit alone wondering if anyone will ever choose you. He shouldn't have to wonder." The adoption had been finalized 6 months ago, and Carlos was blossoming in ways that reminded everyone of Isabella's own transformation. He was artistic where Isabella was scientific, outgoing where she'd been reserved. But he shared her deep empathy and her instinct to help others who were struggling. "Isabella," Emma said softly, "read the letter." Isabella pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket, something she'd written the night before, trying to capture everything she wanted. To say to the mother who had given her life but couldn't stay to see what that life became. "Dear Mama," Isabella began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I'm 16 now, which means I've lived more years with my chosen family than I did with you. But I carry you with me every day in the way I think about problems, in the way I treat people who are hurting, in the way I understand that love is the only thing that multiplies when you share it. I'm going to MIT in the fall to study conservation biology. My research on butterfly migration has helped protect habitats in 12 states now. But more than that, our foundation has helped 847 children find families or stay with families who might have been separated by system failures. Every child who doesn't have to sit alone at a funeral, every family that gets reunited, every kid who finds out they're not as alone as they thought. That's your legacy too." "I learned something important this year, Mama. I used to think the saddest thing was that you died before I could really know you. But now I understand that I do know you. I know you in the strength you gave me, in the values you instilled even when I was too young to understand them, in the way you made sure I would be found by people who could love me the way you wanted to love me, but ran out of time to do. You made the hardest choice a mother can make. You trusted that someone would catch me when you couldn't hold on anymore. And you were right. Someone did catch me. Lots of someones, actually." Isabella paused, looking around at the faces surrounding Margaret's grave, this chosen family that had grown from tragedy into something beautiful and strong and permanent. "I want you to know that I'm happy, Mama, really, truly happy, not just successful or accomplished, but happy in the way that comes from being completely yourself, with people who love all the parts of you, even the complicated ones. I have a dad who shows up for every presentation and every nightmare with equal dedication. I have a sister who keeps me grounded and reminds me to eat lunch when I'm too focused on research. I have a little brother who draws me pictures of butterflies and helps me remember that science is supposed to be joyful. I have a great aunt who teaches me our family recipes and tells me stories about who I come from. I have friends who challenge my mind and mentors who guide my dreams, and a community of people who believe that love creates families in ways that have nothing to do with blood or law. Most importantly, I have learned how to be someone others can count on. I know how to show up when showing up matters. I know how to see children who are sitting alone and remind them they're not invisible. I know how to turn loss into purpose and grief into action, and loneliness into connection. Thank you for giving me life, Mama. Thank you for loving me enough to let me go. Thank you for trusting that love would find a way, even when everything seemed impossible." Isabella folded the letter and placed it under the flowers, a private message meant just for Margaret. But as she stood up, Carlos tugged on her hand. "Isabella," he said in the shy voice he still used when he wasn't sure if he was allowed to ask questions. "Do you think my parents would be proud of me too, for finding a family and being happy?" Isabella knelt down to Carlos's eye level, seeing herself at his age in his uncertain expression. "Carlos, I think your parents are amazed by how brave you've been and how much love you've brought to all of us. And I think they're grateful that you found us, just like I'm grateful that we found each other." Carlos nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by stepping forward and placing his own small drawing on Margaret's grave. A picture of butterflies carrying children on their wings, flying toward a house where people were waiting with open arms. "This is for Isabella's first mama," Carlos announced, to say thank you for taking care of Isabella until our dad could find her. Marcus felt tears he hadn't expected, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom of an 8-year-old who understood instinctively that Margaret deserved gratitude, not just grief. As they walked back to their cars, Isabella fell into step beside Marcus. At 16, she was nearly as tall as he was, brilliant and accomplished and confident in ways that still amazed him. But she was also still his daughter, still the little girl who had whispered, "You're the only one who came," and changed his understanding of what family could be. "Dad," Isabella said quietly, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that, sweetheart?" "When I was little, I used to think the most important thing about that day at Mama's funeral was that you came when no one else did. But now, I think the most important thing was that you stayed. Anyone can show up once, but you've been showing up every day for 10 years. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Isabella, showing up for you has been the easiest thing I've ever done. You made it easy to love you." Isabella shook her head. "Dad, I was broken when you found me. I was grieving and scared and didn't know how to trust anyone. You didn't fall in love with an easy child. You chose to love a complicated one, and you kept choosing that love even when it was hard." As they reached the car, where Emma and Carlos were already buckled in and discussing plans for ice cream, Isabella turned to face Marcus fully. "I want you to know that everything good in my life, my education, my research, my confidence, my ability to help other kids, it all traces back to that moment when you decided that a lonely little girl at a funeral mattered enough to approach. You didn't just give me a family, Dad. You gave me the understanding that I was worth showing up for, and that's the gift I want to spend my life giving to other people." Marcus pulled Isabella into a hug, marveling at how this extraordinary young woman had grown from the frightened child he'd met at Margaret's funeral. She was heading to MIT in a few months, ready to change the world through her research and advocacy, but she was also still the daughter who helped Carlos with his homework, who called Elena every week, who remembered the birthdays of every child their foundation had helped. "I'm proud of you, Isabella," Marcus said simply, "not just for your achievements, but for who you've become. You've turned your own experience of loss into a superpower for helping others heal." As they drove home together, this family that had been built from pieces of other broken families, held together by choice and love and an unshakable commitment to showing up for each other. Marcus reflected on the 10 years that had passed since that rainy funeral. Isabella Chen Martinez, she'd legally taken both family names when she turned 16, was no longer the little girl who believed she was. Alone in the world, she was a young woman surrounded by love, guided by purpose, and committed to ensuring that no child would ever have to sit alone at a funeral, wondering if anyone cared enough to come. The ripples from that single act of showing up had spread far beyond what Marcus could have imagined. Hundreds of children had found families through their foundation. Isabella's research was protecting habitats and species. Carlos was thriving in ways that proved healing was possible. Elena had reconnected with a family she thought she'd lost forever. But perhaps most importantly, they had all learned that love really does multiply when you share it, that families can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with someone simply deciding to show up when everyone else walks away. Isabella was right. Anyone can show up once. But a family is made of people who keep showing up, day after day, year after year, through joy and sorrow and all the ordinary moments in between, and they would keep showing up for each other and for all the children still waiting to discover. They're not alone for as long as love gave them strength to do so. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.